Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight, let us journey to the mystical kingdom of Eldor, where twilight lingers softly, casting the world in gentle shades of peace and magic. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the whispers of this ancient tale guide you into restful sleep. Now, let's begin our story. In the kingdom of Eldor, twilight was spoken of as a fleeting beauty, a soft silken veil that lingered just before nightfall, casting the world in hues of indigo and rose. But in the northern woods, where even the sun dared not tread, there lay a castle where twilight was not a passing moment, but an eternal state. The castle of eternal twilight, they called it, for its walls seemed to breathe shadows and light, held in a spell that bound it to neither day nor night. The villagers told tales of the place with hushed voices, eyes glancing over shoulders as though they could feel the castle's strange pull from miles away. And at the heart of every tale was a whisper of sorrow, a murmured legend of lost souls who roamed its halls, forgotten by the world, clinging to something unfulfilled. None dared to approach it, for the stories were clear. To enter was to risk one's spirit being lost to the gloom, forever bound to the castle's cursed twilight. But for Prince Alaric, heir to Eldor's throne, these warnings were not enough. He had grown up on tales of the castle, each story seeping into his young heart, feeding a hunger for mystery and purpose. The older he grew, the more he felt a strange call from the north, as if the castle itself knew him, beckoning him. It was a pull both haunting and undeniable, and though he did not understand it, he could not ignore it. He knew deep in his bones that he must go, that somehow his fate was tied to the castle's shadowed walls. On the night of his oath, Alaric stood in the great hall, the flickering light of torches casting his face in gold and shadow. His father, King Edrin, watched him with wary eyes, knowing well the power of the ancient curse. "You must understand, Alaric," he said in a voice that was both stern and soft. "Many have tried to lift the curse, yet none have returned. There is a darkness there, older than our bloodline. The castle claims all who dare disturb its rest." But Alaric, resolute, met his father's gaze. "If there is a darkness, then it is all the more reason to confront it. The souls within are not shadows, father. They were once people, lost and forgotten. I cannot leave them bound to that place without trying. I swear upon my honor, I will enter the castle of eternal twilight and free them no matter the cost." The words hung heavy in the air, an oath uttered with more finality than he knew. For as he spoke, a chill settled upon the hall, and a breeze swept through as if the castle itself had heard and marked his vow. His father sighed, but Alaric could see a glimmer of pride beneath the worry in his eyes. King Edrin placed a hand on his son's shoulder, nodding solemnly, for he knew that Alaric's path was set. At dawn, Alaric donned his cloak and armed himself with a sword of silver crafted with runes said to guard against spirits and dark enchantments. With only a small pack and a heart brimming with both courage and fear, he rode northward, following the path toward the castle he had traced so many times in his mind. As he ventured deeper into the forest, a mist began to gather, thick and spectral, swallowing the sunlight and muffling all sound. The silence was unnatural, as if even the earth held its breath in the presence of the castle. Trees loomed above him, their twisted branches like skeletal fingers stretching toward a leaden sky. He felt a strange sensation of being watched, though there was no one around. Yet shadows flickered at the edge of his vision, vanishing the moment he turned his head. Hours passed, and Alaric felt a strange weight upon him, a heaviness that seeped into his heart with each step closer to the castle. It was as though the twilight itself wrapped around him, binding him to this haunted path. And then, through the mist, he saw it, the castle of eternal twilight. The castle stood on a hill, a silhouette against the darkened sky, its towers and turrets stretching into the gloom like fingers grasping at the last light. Alaric dismounted, unable to take his eyes off the structure. The stones were a deep, somber grey, seemingly alive with shadows that shifted and pulsed as if the castle itself breathed. Windows peered out like empty eyes, watching him approach. As he crossed the narrow bridge that spanned the castle's mist-covered moat, Alaric saw faint figures drifting along the water's edge. Souls, he realized, trapped between realms, their faces blurred but filled with a sorrow that struck him to his core. They turned toward him, their hollow eyes gleaming with a strange, desperate hope. With a shiver, Alaric whispered to himself, "I have come to free you. I swear it." The words faded into the mist, but he felt a weight lift as if the souls had heard him, and for the first time believed. Yet a warning echoed in his mind. His own spirit was now tied to the castle, bound by his oath. The air grew thicker as Alaric crossed the threshold of the castle, the heavy iron doors creaking as though waking from a long, dreadful sleep. They closed behind him with a sound that echoed through the empty halls, sealing him inside. He was left standing in a vast entrance chamber cloaked in a dim, perpetual twilight. A chill crept down his spine. The air itself felt alive, as though the very walls watched him with quiet curiosity. The faint glow of his lantern cast shadows that danced across the stone floor, where ancient mosaics lay cracked and faded. Dust swirled in the air, catching faint glimmers of light as he took his first cautious steps. Portraits lined the walls, each face worn by centuries of decay, their eyes following him with expressions twisted in longing, grief, and despair. He could feel their silent pleas, the weight of lives forgotten, but not at rest. The corridors seemed endless, winding and twisting as though deliberately confusing him, leading him deeper into the castle's labyrinthine heart. Every now and then he felt a cold whisper brush past his ear, but when he turned, there was nothing but shadows. The silence pressed upon him, thick and suffocating, as if each stone bore the memories of sorrowful centuries, holding its secrets close. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time seemed to have no meaning here. Alaric began to feel the first pangs of unease, a slow erosion of courage as the oppressive twilight seeped into his very soul. He saw the shadowy forms of the trapped souls drifting through the corridors, their faces blurred and indistinct, their movements slow, as if wading through invisible currents. They moved with a strange grace, barely acknowledging his presence, yet each step seemed drawn towards him as though some faint hope still lingered in their forgotten hearts. A voice, faint as a whisper on the wind, seemed to drift to him from one of the shadowed hallways. He paused, straining to hear, his heartbeat pounding in his chest. The voice grew clearer, sorrowful and soft, echoing with an age-old grief. Who walks among us brave and lost? Another fool come to be chained to our fate. The words struck him, resonating with a strange sadness that filled the empty hall. Alaric tightened his grip on his sword, his voice steady, yet tinged with a quiet dread. I am Alaric, Prince of Eldor, and I have sworn to free you all. A low, bitter laugh echoed in response, a sound as cold as the mist that lingered in every corner. So many have made such promises. None have succeeded. Do you not feel it, young prince? The twilight grows within you, creeping into your bones, drawing you into our prison. Soon, you will be one of us, a spirit of sorrow, bound to wander these halls. Alaric shook his head, forcing away the chill of doubt that tried to claw its way into his heart. Number, I am not here to surrender. Show me the way to lift the curse. Tell me what binds you to this place. There was a long silence, filled only by the faint rustling of unseen spirits drifting nearby. And then, slowly the voice returned, softer, laced with a weary acceptance. We are bound by sorrow, by betrayals and regrets that chain our souls. Each of us was once alive, held to this world by love, by promises broken, by wounds that never healed. It is not a curse you can lift with a blade or a spell. To free us, you must mend what we could not, face what we could not bear. The words filled Alaric with a growing sense of dread, but he pressed forward, compelled by the weight of his oath. He moved deeper into the castle, down narrow staircases that led to chambers untouched by light. Shadows stretched long across the floors, seeming to pulse with a life of their own, reaching out to him like spectral hands, whispering of forgotten sorrows. Finally, he entered a chamber filled with dust-laden mirrors, each one cracked and weathered, reflecting fragmented images of the prince's own weary face. Here, he felt the full weight of the souls trapped within the castle, their silent suffering thick in the air. It was as if their emotions, pain, regret, longing, were held within each crack, each shard. They watched him with eyes both longing and resigned, waiting for something they did not dare hope to see. One of the mirrors, larger than the rest, seemed to shimmer with a strange light. Alaric stepped closer, drawn by a faint pulse within it. As he peered into its depths, he saw not his own reflection, but the ghostly image of a young woman. Her face was beautiful, yet sorrowful, her eyes clouded with a sadness that seemed endless. She spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Prince of Eldor, you seek to break the curse, but to do so you must face not only our suffering, but your own. Are you prepared to confront the darkness within yourself?" Alaric's breath caught. He felt the weight of her words settling over him, an invitation and a warning both. He nodded slowly, his voice unwavering but quiet. "Yes, I will face whatever I must. Show me the way." The woman's face softened, a flicker of hope kindling in her spectral eyes. She raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, and Alaric felt the faintest touch upon his own. With a final whisper, she vanished, leaving only his own reflection. A lone figure cast in shadows, bound to a destiny that now felt heavier than ever. And so, with a heart filled with both determination and dread, Alaric prepared to confront not only the souls of the castle, but the darkness within his own spirit, a shadow he could not yet fully see. The air thickened as Alaric moved deeper into the castle's heart, where silence reigned and the twilight deepened. It felt as though each step drew him further from the world he knew, pulling him into a liminal space where neither light nor shadow truly belonged. The corridors were lined with decaying tapestries, their once vibrant scenes faded into ghostly images of feasts and wars, lives lived and lost, remnants of a world that had long since passed into memory. It was in one such corridor that he first encountered them, the spirits bound to their sorrow, moving in a silent procession. There were men and women, children and elders, all drifting with eyes fixed on memories he could not see. Each figure was translucent, barely more than an impression left behind, yet their expressions were vivid, carrying a sorrow that seemed to seep from their very forms. Alaric watched them, his heart aching, feeling each of their regrets as though they were his own. One spirit, a tall man clad in the armor of an ancient knight, stopped in his slow procession, turning hollow eyes upon Alaric. The man's face bore an expression of anguish, a grief that seemed unending. Alaric sensed that this soul, once brave and strong, was now bound to the castle by an unyielding regret. "Why do you linger here?" Alaric asked, his voice quiet but resolute. The knight's gaze grew distant, his form flickering like a dying flame. I once swore to protect the innocent, to stand as a shield against all harm. But in my pride, I betrayed those I loved most. My failure cost them their lives, and so here I remain, bound to this place by the weight of my broken oath. Alaric felt a pang of empathy, recognizing in the night a reflection of his own fears, of making a promise he could not fulfill. He wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but the night's form dissolved, drifting back into the shadows like mist, leaving only silence in his wake. The next spirit he encountered was a young woman, her form delicate and shimmering, as though woven from starlight. She stood at the edge of a balcony, her gaze fixed upon the horizon that would never see dawn. Her face was etched with sorrow, her eyes hollow with longing. "What binds you here?" Alaric asked gently. She turned toward him, her expression filled with a longing so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. "I was once in love, and for that love I gave up everything. But he betrayed me, left me alone in a world I no longer recognized. My heart became an anchor, chaining me to this castle, bound by love that turned to despair." As she spoke, Alaric felt a flicker of her pain seep into him, a sense of abandonment, a wound that would never heal. Sorrow was so deep, so consuming, that he staggered beneath its weight. He wanted to tell her she could let go, but he sensed her heart was bound too tightly to her past. The memory of love now was heavy as iron. The spirits he met carried their sorrows like chains, each one bound by a moment they could not escape, a regret that echoed through the ages. As he walked among them, Alaric began to feel the edges of his own fears and doubts rising within him, shadows he had buried long ago. In their stories, he saw pieces of himself, a fear of failure, a fear of loss, a fear of facing what lay hidden within his own heart. Guided by an instinct he could not name, Alaric entered the castle's chapel, a forgotten place where dust lay thick upon the pews, and candles, long extinguished, sat in rows like sentinels to a faded memory. The air was heavy with sorrow, the walls darkened by centuries of neglect. At the altar, a spirit knelt, a figure in tattered robes, their head bowed, murmuring prayers that dissolved into silence. Alaric approached, feeling the pull of the spirit's grief. He recognized the weight upon the figure's shoulders, the sense of failure that pressed upon their spirit like a cloak of lead. "What regret holds you here?" he asked softly, his voice filled with both dread and compassion. The spirit looked up, their eyes hollow, yet piercing, as if they could see through to his very soul. "I was the keeper of this castle, a servant to its people. When darkness fell, I failed to protect them. I could not lift the curse that now binds us. And so I remain, forever pleading for redemption that will never come." A chill crept through Alaric, for he understood then that this figure, bound by guilt and duty, was a reflection of what he himself might become if he failed. To carry such a weight, to be bound not by chains but by his own heart, was a fate he could barely comprehend. Yet he knew he must face it, for only by understanding the depth of the spirit's sorrow could he hope to free them. The spirit's gaze softened, almost kind, as if sensing Alaric's determination. To lift this curse, brave prince, you must first confront what lies within. These souls are bound not by enchantments, but by the darkest parts of their hearts, by wounds that could not heal. And you must find the strength to heal them, even if it means facing your own deepest fears. With those words, the spirit faded, leaving Alaric alone in the chapel, surrounded by shadows that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. The silence grew heavy, the twilight pressing in as he realized the magnitude of his task. He stood in the empty hall, knowing he could no longer ignore the fear stirring within him, the doubts that had lingered unspoken in the corners of his mind. To free the spirits, he would need more than bravery or strength. He would need to confront himself, to delve into the darkness within, for only then could he hope to bring light to the shadows that bound them all. Alaric wandered through the endless corridors, each shadowed corner and forgotten room, pulling him further into the heart of the castle. The voices of the spirits had quieted, leaving him alone with the weight of their sorrows echoing in his mind. He was aware, with a growing certainty, that this journey was not merely one of halls and chambers, but of his own heart. A descent into his innermost fears, doubts, and regrets. At last, he arrived at a vast, dimly lit chamber that seemed to pulse with a quiet, unseen life. It was colder here, the air thick with a strange metallic tang that made his skin prickle. In the center of the room stood an ancient mirror, grand and terrible, its frame twisted and dark, as though carved from the shadows themselves. It was larger than any mirror he had ever seen, nearly reaching the ceiling, and the glass was marred with cracks that stretched like veins, casting fragmented reflections across the room. Alaric approached cautiously, feeling an inexplicable pull as he stood before the mirror. At first he saw only his own reflection, cast in shadows and lit by the faint dying light. But as he looked deeper, his reflection began to shift, its face twisting in subtle ways, showing not just the prince, but something more. A hidden, buried version of himself. The reflection smirked, its eyes darker than his own, filled with doubt and despair. An image of himself bound by fear. It was as if the mirror knew his thoughts, sensing the shadows he kept buried within, bringing them to the surface like darkened water rising from a well. "What are you so afraid of, Alaric?" the reflection whispered, its voice as smooth as silk, but cold and biting. "Do you really believe you can save these souls? Or do you fear that, like those before you, You will fail and become one of them. Another lost spirit wandering these halls. The word struck him, piercing through his resolve like an arrow, exposing doubts he had tried to bury. Alaric clenched his fist, his heart racing as he fought against the voice's insidious whispers. "I am here to help them," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I will not leave them to suffer in this twilight." The reflection sneered, eyes glinting with something sharp and cruel. "Is that truly why you came? Or is it to prove yourself worthy of the throne? Perhaps you believe that by saving these lost souls, you will be seen as brave, noble, free of weakness. But are you?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy with a truth Alaric could not deny. He had long feared that beneath his determination there was a desperation for validation, a need to prove himself, to be something greater than his doubts. He had taken this journey with a heart weighted by questions he dared not ask. And now the mirror forced him to confront them all. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself, gazing into the reflection, not with defiance, but with honesty. "Perhaps you're right," he whispered, the words soft yet resolute. "Perhaps I did come here, in part, to prove something. But that does not change what I have sworn to do. I may be flawed, fearful, even prideful, but I will not turn back now." For a brief moment, the reflection's eyes softened, as though Alaric's resolve had touched even this dark image of himself. And then, with a sickening crack, the glass began to change, the fractures widening, splitting the reflection into dozens of faces, each one a twisted, sorrowful version of Alaric himself, faces filled with grief, fear, and regret, all reaching toward him, begging for release. Alaric watched, horrified as the faces began to speak, their voices a cacophony of anguish, each one pleading, accusing, imploring him to let them go, to save them. The noise swelled, filling the room with a sound like thunder, drowning out all thought. He clutched his head, closing his eyes, feeling the weight of each spirit, each fragment of sorrow pressing upon him, as though they were all pieces of himself, parts he had left unseen, abandoned. And then through the noise, a single voice rose, soft and clear. It was the voice of the woman he had seen in the mirror before, the one whose face had been etched with both love and despair. Her voice cut through the cacophony, calm and steady, a quiet light in the storm. "Alaric, listen to me. You must forgive yourself. These spirits, this curse, they are bound by regret, by wounds they could not mend. Only by letting go of your own sorrow, your own doubts, can you hope to release them. Do not hold on to what was, but what can still be. Free yourself, and you will free us all." The words struck deep, resonating within him like a bell, clearing the storm of voices, silencing the reflections. Alaric opened his eyes, the room falling quiet once more, and he saw his own face in the mirror, steady and whole. He understood then that the only way to lift the curse was not through force or bravery, but by finding peace within himself. With a trembling breath, he placed a hand upon the mirror, feeling its cool, fractured surface beneath his fingers. He let the memories of his fears, his regrets, his mistakes rise within him, not to haunt him, but to release them. One by one, he let go of each burden, forgiving himself for his pride, his doubts, his hidden fears. The mirror trembled beneath his touch, the cracks beginning to fade as though they too were letting go of the pain that had bound them. A warm light spread from where his hand rested, filling the chamber, washing away the shadows and sorrow. He felt a weight lift from his soul, a quiet peace settling over him. And as the light grew, he saw the spirits around him, their faces softening, freed from their eternal twilight, their expressions now serene, no longer bound by sorrow. One by one, they began to fade, their forms dissolving into light, drifting toward a dawn that awaited them beyond the castle's walls. When the last spirit disappeared, Alaric stood alone, the chamber empty and silent, the twilight gone, leaving only peace. The silence in the castle felt different now, no longer heavy with sorrow, but serene, as if it held a new clarity, a peace woven through the stone itself. Alaric stood before the mirror, which now reflected only his true self, the cracks gone, the surface smooth and clear. He looked into his own eyes, feeling a strange kinship with the face that gazed back. He was no longer the same prince who had entered these haunted halls, bound by doubts and hidden fears. The journey through the twilight had changed him. He turned away from the mirror, the quiet light illuminating his path as he made his way back through the castle. Each corridor, each chamber that had once seemed alive with shadows and sorrow, now felt empty, yet tranquil, as though the walls themselves were finally at rest. He passed the fading portraits of forgotten rulers and guardians, their painted eyes now softened, no longer filled with the weight of their regrets. As he walked, he caught glimpses of the spirits he had met, the knight who had carried the burden of a broken oath, the young woman with the shattered heart, the servant who had failed to protect his people. They stood at the edges of his vision, watching him with faces free of grief, their forms delicate and translucent, like mist touched by sunlight. One by one, they nodded, expressions of gratitude upon their faces, as if to say farewell to him, their savior and their kin in sorrow. The spirits began to fade as he reached the grand entrance hall, their forms dissolving into a soft glow, like fireflies at dusk. The last spirit to linger was the woman from the mirror, the one who had guided him with her gentle wisdom, her quiet courage. She stood beside him, her form as faint as breath upon glass, her eyes filled with something more than peace, a kind of bittersweet joy, a release long awaited. "Thank you, Alaric," she whispered, her voice like a breeze that stirred memories he did not know he held. "You have freed us, and in doing so, you have freed yourself. Remember that peace is not the absence of darkness, but the acceptance of it. You carry our gratitude, our love. Go now, and live fully, with light in your heart." She reached out, brushing her hand against his cheek, in a touch so delicate it felt more like a memory than a reality. Then, with a final gentle smile, she faded into the warm light, joining the others as they rose through the open archway, floating like stars toward the dawn that now peeked over the horizon, casting a pale golden light over the land. Alaric watched them disappear into the sky, his heart swelling with both sorrow and joy. The twilight lifted, the last shadows melting into the light of morning. For the first time in centuries, the castle of eternal twilight stood bathed in sunlight, its walls glowing softly, no longer bound by gloom, but by a quiet peace that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the world around it. With a sense of finality, Alaric pushed open the heavy iron doors and stepped out into the dawning light. The castle lay behind him, its weight lifted from his shoulders, a memory both distant and close, woven into his soul. As he walked away, he felt the warmth of the sun upon his face, the first true light he had seen since entering the castle's shadowed halls. The path home was unfamiliar, yet each step felt lighter, the burdens he had carried left behind in the twilight. Alaric's heart was no longer filled with the restless hunger that had driven him northward. For he understood now that his worth did not lie in his accomplishments or bravery, but in his ability to face the darkness within himself with compassion. He knew that he could return home, not as the prince weighed down by doubts, but as someone who had made peace with his own spirit. When he finally reached the edge of the forest, he turned once to look back. The castle, once looming and dark, now stood quietly, touched by the morning sun. It no longer held the mysterious pull it once had. It was simply a place, a relic of sorrow, now at rest. Alaric bowed his head, offering a silent farewell to the souls he had freed, and the part of himself he had left behind within its walls. And so he returned to Eldor, his heart unburdened, the castle now only a memory of twilight and shadows, transformed by a dawn that he carried within him. And though he would never forget the spirits or the lessons they had taught him, he knew that the journey was not meant to haunt him, but to guide him forward. His spirit renewed, ready to face whatever lay ahead in the light of the last twilight he would ever need. For he had found the courage to face both shadow and light, to walk in peace, and to carry the last light of the castle forever within his heart.